What if Aston Martin isn't just spending billions to compete in 2026, but because failing this time isn't an option anymore? Behind the scenes, this is being described as the most expensive and irreversible gamble in the team's history, one where factories, people, and reputation are all tied to a single outcome. No fallback plan. No gradual rebuild. Rivals are quietly asking a brutal question. If this level of investment still isn't enough, what does that say about Aston Martin's place in modern Formula One? And here's the reason this story matters more than it seems. The moment you understand where the money is really going and what happens if it doesn't work, you realize this isn't just about 2026. It's about whether this project can ever afford to fail again. What separates Aston Martin's 2026 gamble from every rebuild that came before it is permanence. This isn't money spent to improve competitiveness. It's money spent to remove excuses forever. Once you build a factory like this, hire people like this, and lock into partnerships like this, there's no narrative left to hide behind. No transition year. No learning phase. From this point on, results are no longer contextual. They are definitive. The scale of the investment only makes sense if you understand where it's actually going. Not into one car. Not into one regulation cycle. But into changing the structural limits of what Aston Martin can be. The new campus isn't designed to catch up. It's designed to sustain pressure at the front. Wind tunnel capacity. Simulation throughput. Manufacturing autonomy. These aren't tools for a midfield team trying to punch above its weight. They're tools for a team that believes it should never fall back again. What's unsettling for rivals is how little of this spending is about immediate visibility. There are no flashy announcements tied to performance promises. No public timelines. No championship guarantees. Aston Martin has chosen to let the money disappear into foundations rather than headlines. That tells you something important. They aren't trying to impress the outside world. They're trying to remove internal doubt. And once doubt disappears inside an organization, behavior changes quickly. But this kind of investment also creates a trap. When you build everything at once, nothing can fail quietly. If correlation is off, it's not a small problem. If the engine underperforms, it compromises everything around it. If integration struggles, there's no legacy structure to lean on. The project doesn't degrade gradually. It fractures. That's the risk of betting on total alignment rather than incremental growth. Inside the paddock, some teams privately admire the boldness. Others quietly question the timing. Because Formula One history is full of teams that spend enormous sums trying to compress learning curves that only time can smooth out. Money accelerates processes. It doesn't replace intuition. And intuition is usually built through years of success and failure at the top. Aston Martin is trying to manufacture that intuition under pressure. The involvement of figures like Adrian Newey raises the ceiling dramatically. But it also raises expectations to a level that's unforgiving. Newey-led projects don't get the benefit of the doubt. If they struggle, the assumption isn't, it's too early. It's, something fundamental is wrong. That narrative will form quickly if early signs don't align with the ambition that's been so heavily funded. And this is where the question of payoff becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because Aston Martin doesn't need to win immediately for this investment to make sense. But it does need to look inevitable. It needs to look like a team on a path that only leads one way. If 2026 reveals coherence, patience will follow. If it reveals confusion, no amount of spending will stop the doubt from spreading. That's why this gamble isn't really about money at all. It's about whether Aston Martin can turn unprecedented investment into something Formula One values even more than cash. Belief. As the implications of that spending become clearer, another tension starts to surface that Aston Martin can't escape. Once you invest at this level, the sport stops judging you by effort and starts judging you by intent. Every decision is assumed to be deliberate. Every weakness is assumed to be inexcusable. There's no room for, we're building towards something, when the something has already been built around you. That's the invisible cost of spending billions. You don't just buy capability. You buy scrutiny. What makes this particularly dangerous is that Aston Martin's investment isn't modular. It's interconnected. The factory was designed around a certain development speed. The wind tunnel assumes a certain aerodynamic philosophy. The Honda partnership assumes a certain level of electrical performance. The Newey-led design assumes all of that converges on time. If one piece lags, the others don't simply wait. They amplify the delay. That's why rivals aren't fixated on whether Aston Martin will be fast. They're watching to see whether the whole structure moves as one. There's also a psychological shift that happens inside a team when money removes constraints. Limits disappear, but accountability explodes. Engineers no longer debate what's possible. They debate why something isn't working yet. That can be empowering, but it can also be corrosive if progress stalls. Under this level of investment, patience becomes a finite resource. Even when leadership says there's time, everyone knows there isn't much. Rivals understand this dynamic well, because many of them have lived through versions of it. The difference is scale. Aston Martin hasn't upgraded one area. They've rebuilt everything simultaneously. That shortens the runway for excuses. If the car struggles, there's no next phase to point to. This is the phase. Which means the sport will make its judgment early, even if that judgment isn't fair. Another uncomfortable reality is that success now has to look convincing, not just measurable. Aston Martin doesn't need to win races immediately. But it does need to look like a team whose trajectory is irreversible. Clean execution. Logical upgrades. Drivers who sound confident rather than hopeful. Those signals will matter more than points in the early stages. Because they determine whether the paddock believes the money bought clarity or just scale. This is where the investment intersects with reputation in a way that can't be managed. If this works, Aston Martin becomes proof that a modern team can engineer relevance deliberately. If it doesn't, it reinforces the oldest belief in Formula One. That success can't be rushed, no matter how much you spend. That belief is stubborn. And it's waiting to be either challenged or confirmed by what happens next. Which brings the story back to the question no one inside Aston Martin can answer yet. Not whether the billions will pay off, but whether they've been spent in a way that creates inevitability rather than expectation. Because expectation collapses under pressure. Inevitability survives it. And as 2026 approaches, that distinction will decide whether this gamble becomes a foundation for a new era, or the most expensive lesson Aston Martin has ever learned. As the spotlight intensifies, one final pressure begins to dominate every conversation around Aston Martin's spending spree. Irreversibility. This isn't an investment you unwind if results disappoint. The factory doesn't shrink. The wind tunnel doesn't pause. The personnel don't quietly disperse. Everything Aston Martin has built for 2026 commits the team to a permanent level of expectation, regardless of outcomes. That permanence is what makes this gamble different from any short-term surge in spending we've seen before. What follows from that is a shift in how failure would be interpreted. If Aston Martin underperforms, it won't be seen as a missed opportunity. It will be seen as a structural misjudgment. As proof that even perfect conditions can't shortcut competitive gravity. That's why the stakes feel heavier here than with most rebuilds. The investment isn't just financial. It's philosophical. It's a statement about how Formula One success should be built in the modern era. Inside the team, this creates a delicate balance between confidence and pressure. Engineers are empowered like never before, but they're also exposed like never before. Every department knows there's nowhere else to look if something doesn't work. No outdated facility to blame. No missing expertise to point at. No transitional excuse left on the table. That clarity can sharpen focus, but it can also magnify doubt if momentum stalls. Rivals sense this vulnerability, even if they won't say it publicly. They understand that Aston Martin must look convincing early, not dominant, but convincing. The difference matters. Convincing teams earn patience. Unconvincing teams invite scrutiny. And scrutiny, in a project of this scale, spreads quickly into politics, media narratives, and internal tension. That's why the opening phase of 2026 carries disproportionate weight for Aston Martin compared to others. There's also a long-term risk that goes beyond championships. If this investment doesn't translate into front-running credibility, it reshapes how future ambition is viewed across the sport. It sends a message that even total alignment of money, people, and timing may not be enough. That message would resonate far beyond one team. It would influence how owners invest, how manufacturers commit, and how the FIA frames future regulations. In that sense, Aston Martin's gamble carries consequences well outside its own garage. At the same time, there's an upside that explains why this risk was taken at all. If the project works, even gradually, Aston Martin doesn't just become competitive. It becomes permanent. A team with gravity. A team others plan around. A team whose success isn't questioned every season. That transformation is what the billions are really chasing. Not trophies alone, but permanence at the top table. And that's where the story deliberately refuses to resolve itself. Because whether Aston Martin's investment pays off won't be decided by one race, or even one season. It will be decided by whether the team emerges from 2026 looking inevitable or fragile, coherent or reactive, calm or defensive. Those signals will tell the paddock everything it needs to know. And once they appear, the verdict on this gamble will already be forming, quietly, long before history writes it down. As the final phase of this gamble approaches, another reality becomes impossible to ignore. Aston Martin isn't just trying to buy performance. They're trying to buy time in a sport that punishes impatience more than mistakes. And paradoxically, the more money they've spent, the less time they're allowed. That's the contradiction at the heart of this project. The investment was meant to remove pressure, yet it has concentrated it into a single, unavoidable moment. 2026 isn't a checkpoint. It's a reveal. What makes this moment so dangerous is that Formula One doesn't wait for projects to mature. It categorizes them quickly. Teams are labeled as threats, pretenders, or distractions within months of a regulation reset. Once that label sticks, it shapes how rivals race you, how the FIA listens to you, and how sponsors evaluate you. Aston Martin spending guarantees attention. But attention without validation turns into skepticism very fast. That's why the team doesn't just need progress. It needs credibility. Inside the paddock, there's an unspoken belief that Aston Martin has crossed a psychological line. They are no longer judged like a rising team. They are judged like an established one. That means reliability problems aren't growing pains. They're red flags. Development delays aren't part of the process. They're warning signs. This is the hidden cost of ambition at scale. The margin between acceptable struggle and unacceptable weakness becomes razor thin. There's also the question of internal endurance. Sustaining belief over multiple seasons is far harder than creating it. If early results don't match expectations, frustration doesn't disappear just because leadership remains committed. It accumulates quietly. Engineers second guess. Drivers recalibrate their confidence. Small compromises begin to feel justified. Aston Martin's challenge won't be avoiding mistakes. It will be preventing erosion of conviction when progress is slower than the investment suggests it should be. Rivals know this, which is why they aren't rushing to judge Aston Martin's car on raw pace alone. They're watching reactions. How does the team respond to adversity? Do they look aligned or fractured? Do updates follow a clear logic or feel corrective? These cues matter more than points early on. Because teams that truly justify massive investment don't just get faster, they get calmer. There's also a broader implication hanging over all of this. If Aston Martin succeeds, it rewrites what's possible in modern Formula One. It proves that with enough commitment, patience, and authority, a team can engineer relevance rather than wait for it. But if it fails, it reinforces the opposite belief. That success is still rooted in legacy, continuity, and hard-earned intuition. That no amount of spending can replace time at the front. Either outcome reshapes how the sport thinks about ambition. And this is why the payoff question can't be answered yet. Not because there isn't enough information, but because the kind of payoff Aston Martin is chasing isn't immediate. They aren't buying wins alone. They're buying permanence, belonging, the right to be taken seriously every season without explanation. Whether that investment delivers that outcome won't be decided in a single race or a single year. But once the sport decides which direction this story is heading, that judgment will be very hard to reverse.